West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
A very warm welcome, in spite of the weather, or because of the weather possibly, to all those gathering in the hall across Canada, across the United States. As in fact, our guest speaker will be addressing us from the Pacific Northwest, to our friends in the UK and parts of Africa. Welcome to West Hill. At this point in our gathering, we take some very serious moments to reflect on an issue of long standing and an issue that still needs addressing, and that is the land acknowledgement. We are all treaty people, means that people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have a shared responsibility and a shared benefit from the treaties signed between the Indigenous peoples and the governments. While the phrase emphasizes the importance of these treaties in shaping society, it also acknowledges the ongoing struggle for their full implementation and the need for reconciliation. Please join with me in the response reading shown on your screens. West Hill United is located in the Treaty 20 and in the area of the Williams Treaties of 1923. These are the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and were previously occupied by the Seneca and Huron-Wendat First Nations. As treaty people, we now share in the responsibility to care for these lands for the next generations to enjoy. This place is and will continue to be home to Indigenous peoples as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the rivers flow. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work in community here. And we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of the land for thousands of years. We acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people endure in Canada. We accept the responsibility to contribute toward the revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. Amen. At the end of the readings, we customarily add the phrase, offered as wisdom for the journey. And we invite you to respond with the phrase, may we walk in its light. This is simply an invitation to participate if you so wish to do. We have two readings this morning. The first from Mary Oliver in her writing The Journal. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. The second reading comes from Khalil Gibran, the prophet, on joy and sorrow. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you contain. It is not, pardon me, is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven, offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light. Jasmin Faulk is an author, The Last Sandstorm, a memoir, speaker, educator, and executive director of a nonprofit women's advocacy organization. Raised in Saudi Arabia to an Arab father and an Italian mother, she escaped the country as a young woman to pursue a life of freedom, education, and self-determination. Today, Jasmin speaks internationally about women's rights, resilience, the dangers of extremism, and the transformative power of choosing authenticity and common sense over fear. Her work encourages people to examine inherited beliefs, embrace difficult conversations, and build lives rooted in truth rather than obligation. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Jasmin Faulk this morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you. What a pleasure, what a delight, and what an honor to be here today to speak to all of you and to join you in community. It's a wonderful time when we can look at courage as something that we are celebrating rather than an unfortunate necessity and need that many around the world still have to think about every day. And so today I'm going to share a little bit of my story to hopefully connect to the theme with all of you because not by choice, it ended up being the theme of my life. I have some slides to share because I love offering visuals as well. And so I will hope that technology will be on my side and I can go ahead and share with you. And it looks like sharing is happening. Are you able to see just the main slide? I think we're good. Yes,
Yes.
excellent. Great. Well, thank you again. I always say that courage has sort of been a companion that very quietly was in the background of my life, and I never knew that one day I would rely so heavily upon courage. Before I was born, I had no idea what courage was because we come from a realm that we're not sure has decided and sort of depicted our life story. Who I was before courage was a very confused, scared, insecure, and anxious riddled young woman. All of these were things that were internal, certainly not external, because I was not aware of the depth of these influences in my life. And so I just need to, real quick, I have a little, struggling with a little tech thing on my end here, not on your end. I just need to make a slight adjustment. Okay, there we go. So I grew up in separate worlds. I had an identity crisis, and I had deep confusion about what the purpose of my life was. Most people believe that we're born with courage or that we're born with the skills and the gifts that we are offered and given in our lives, but very rarely do we realize that those are skills that we attain or develop through life as we walk life and encounter the challenges that we face. I was born in Saudi Arabia. My origins are very eclectic and unique, certainly during a time when where I was born, the location I was born in, was not at all accustomed to the interesting combination that was my life. My father was born in Saudi Arabia during a time when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was recently founded in the late 1930s. My mother was born in Italy and was raised and grew up in Florence, the capital of the world of culture and heritage and art and all the wonderful things that the Renaissance has brought to our modern world. My father was one of the bright and young, promising young Saudi men in a time post discovering oil and realizing that now there were riches in the country that could help build the country from within. And so, with the support and aid of Western superpowers, these Saudi men were encouraged to go abroad, study, and bring back their knowledge, their skills to build a country that is now today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that we are all aware of. My father chose Italy, Florence specifically, for his destination because he was very interested in architecture and interior design. And there, as a young student in the early 60s, he met my mother, Italian woman. Her field of study was linguistics. She was multilingual. She wanted to be an interpreter and a teacher eventually. And so they met, and the beginning of these first generations of cross-cultural romances began. Now, I say the first generation because up until that point, Saudi Arabia had not seen nor fathomed what it would look like for these cross-cultural relationships to begin. I remember my father telling the story that when he left, his mother told his best friends who were traveling with him to Italy, promise me that you'll make sure Abdelaziz, my father, does not come back with a Western woman, with a foreigner, with an infidel or a non-believer. And all the boys made those promises to their mothers, but none of them kept that promise. In my father's case, he was slightly lucky, even though by unfortunate default, his mother passed away before he ever actually married my mother and brought her back. And so he spent 6 to 8 years in Italy studying, completing his education. And during that time, his relationship with my mother unfolded into a true commitment. These two young people had no idea what they were getting themselves into. And I say this with love and with empathy, but their choices created an aftermath for a generation, certainly for me personally as their child and their other children, my siblings, of unfathomable confusion, lack of direction, and uncertainty. Their choices then influenced, obviously, my life. So the 1970s, they got married in 1969, moved to Saudi Arabia, began a new life. My mother was very eager to explore and embrace this tribal life that was Saudi Arabia. It was traditional. They did not live in the adobe mud house that you see in these pictures. That's the house where my father grew up. But they did go there, and my mother was immediately eager to be accustomed to dress like them. You know, she had braids, she covered, she wanted a veil, she did all the things that she saw women there do, and she did it enthusiastically with a lot of curiosity. She was very eager to know what it was like to live in a different world. My father was sort of unfazed by his sense of need to enforce, I guess, this obligatory way of life on his Western wife, because back in those days, in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had no idea what it was going to look like receiving this wave of Western women. And so there wasn't necessarily at the time the sense of force on the women. But many embraced it out of their love for their new husbands, their excitement for a new culture. Again, all without any kind of idea of what the implications would be on the generation of especially young women that they would be bringing into the world. And so it begins. I was born in 1974 to parents who had no manual of what it was going to look like or what it was going to be to raise young women in a culture that was for sure designed to oppress and silence them by default of culture and extremist religious practices. I was the oldest female, but the second in the order of my sibling configuration. I was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. That's the capital of the country. And the world had already assigned for me my place, my role, my identity. I had no idea of what that looked like, but I knew that at the age of about 2, as far as my memory can go, that something about my life was oddly bizarre, really confusing, uncomfortable, scary. And the mere fact that I knew that my mother did not necessarily belong the way most of the other mothers were, completely part of the culture and an ingrained part of the system and the ecosystem of the culture, that drove me to consistently live with fear. And that fear was the theme of my life. So I lived in between these two worlds, between Saudi Arabia and Italy. I grew up in Saudi Arabia, where every day of my life I was told that I was a girl, I was a woman, I was to be quiet, I was to be meek. I had to make sure that I abided by the laws and regulations set by the males of the culture, the males in the family. And I traveled to Italy with my parents to meet my grandparents or to spend summers there with my Italian family. And I would see a totally different perspective on how women were living and embracing life and showing up with their true selves. Even though Italy is not necessarily the epitome of liberalization or modernization, especially back in those days, as Italian culture is also fairly traditional with its Catholic ways, I did see a drastic and jarring difference between where I was growing up and where I was visiting every summer. And so the question began very early on as a very young child, who am I? I had no idea who I was. Now, I will say here, I'll pause and say that I just recently saw The Odyssey, the movie, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it so much I went to see it twice because it really spoke to me in ways that I'm sure speaks to many of us. This is a thousands plus story that all of us have journeyed. And I, at the time, I didn't know that my story, while unique and unusual, was one shared by many because of our sense of lack of belonging or confusion of belonging. And so my journey began that early, not knowing who I was, where I belonged, and how I would foresee the rest of my life. I was told without a shadow of a doubt that this was the life that was designed for me, that I had to live this life. I grew up with this constant reminder that as a woman, excuse me, I had to know my place, that I had to abide by the laws and rules, and that I had to kind of imagine myself following a track of this perpetual lifestyle of oppression on women. Now, I grew up in Saudi Arabia during the 1970s and 80s, during its most fundamentalist time in history. I know that many today, when I speak, will always question the fact that Saudi Arabia now seems so modern and so liberated, because we see more of Saudi Arabia now in the news and in the media because of the lifestyle that we live with modern technology and social media. But the time that I grew up in Saudi Arabia was very parallel to what we now see in Iran and Afghanistan. The only difference between those two is I grew up in a country of privilege from the materialistic and financial economic standpoint. I did not suffer the struggle of economic injustice, but I certainly had a deficiency in my intellectual and personal pursuit. And so that to me had become sort of my biggest struggle and my frustration and my fear of not ever excelling to the potential that I hoped to have. I never thought of myself as brave or courageous. What I thought is that I was doomed and that I was cursed to a life that I hadn't chosen for myself, and I had no idea how to get out of it. I hadn't reached that point in which I knew that things were going to fall apart so bad that that rock bottom was going to force me to think differently. So I followed suit with what the expectations of the culture and the society was, certainly what my parents' expectation was, despite their naive thoughts that raising a family with their sort of modern and progressive ideals, still in a culture where we had traditions that we had to follow through, it wouldn't be a big deal. We'd kind of figure it out. Us as kids, we were lucky. We had both worlds to draw from, but they had no idea how much at the depth of my core that was an impact for my own sort of identity crisis. So I followed through with what they told me I should do. Despite my doubts, married a young Arab man. I started my life in Saudi Arabia, and I knew in the back of my mind that I wasn't supposed to have children, because if I had children, I would be stuck there for the rest of my life. If any of you have read Not Without My Daughter or seen the movie, that is a reality for many women who marry in that culture because of not just the tradition, but the laws and the regulations of religion will dictate that the father is sort of in charge of the family and the children. And so that fear was always in the back of my mind. The doubts that I had that forced me into making the choices that I made was to say, I've given it my all, I've tried everything you've told me, and I will do what is expected of me. until I can't take it anymore. And that's when the breaking point showed up. That's when I realized that I had to make a decision for myself. That marriage, as expected, did not continue. It failed. And during that failure of that marriage, I decided that I was going to plot my escape. Now, despite how progressive my parents were in terms of how they raised us intellectually and the fact that we traveled, there was, of course, no breakage from the cultural demands of the country because that was the law. Women were not allowed to have sovereignty and freedom to pursue the life that they wanted. And so I couldn't just say, well, I'm actually leaving now. I'm up and going. I'm going to try a life elsewhere, because I knew my parents would never allow that because it would draw shame and attention to them in a culture that had a very clear and concise idea of how women should be living. And so after that divorce, I started plotting my escape. And in the midst of this planning that was very scary, very confusing, I met and fell in love with an American man there that I did not think would happen and did not expect, did not foresee. And in the midst of that love story that was secretive and scary and very hidden, I insisted to find ways to get out of the country. Now, I won't go into details to tell you about that specific escape, but I can tell you that it was a moment in my life when I knew that it's either this or death. And I'm not saying this to be dramatic, but prior to my escaping, many women who attempted escape, including members of the royal family, women who had also had exposure to Western life, every attempted escape was intercepted. Women were caught at the airport and not allowed to leave, many of whom ended up with very drastic and dramatic consequences, some losing their lives, others being imprisoned for the rest of their lives in their homes. And so I knew from what I had seen historically what the expectation or what the potential aftermath was. But at that point, I was so desperate to find myself, to live my truth, that it was worth the risk. I was lucky to be able to plot an escape that I highlight in detail in my story, so I won't go into it right now. But I was determined and I was convinced that I was going to able to get away with it. And the reason why it's an escape is because women can't just leave. You need permission from your guardian male, who could either be your father, your husband, your brother, your grandfather, your uncle, any male member in your family who you would not be married to, exempt the husband, of course, because you are married to him. And in my case, I was divorced, and so my father was who had to give me permission. You cannot literally leave the airport without a written and notarized permission from your father if he's not accompanying you to the airport. You also need a visa, and most embassies, well, actually all embassies at the time, did not grant you that visa without that written letter and permission. And so I had to figure out a way to get out because I knew that my life in Saudi Arabia was no longer an option. And so when no other choice was available to me, that's the choice I made. I was lucky. I was able to make it to the airport, and through the airport, despite how scary that moment was, I did make it out. And I escaped with the man who I had fallen in love with and ventured to the United States. And here's when I realized that courage showed up. It wasn't in my life in Saudi Arabia. It wasn't in the time that I decided I have to do this and I have to escape and I have to plot my future and my destiny. Those were all the moments that were driven by the fear and the ignorance of, the ignorance bliss, I should say, of what that would look like once that escape was actually executed. Courage showed up when I was finally away from it all and I was completely surrendered to a life that I had absolutely no idea what would it look like. I was in my mid-20s, so I was a full-grown adult woman, but had zero adulthood skills in the rest of the world because I grew up in a place where I had no ability to go and speak for myself. I was covered from head to toe at the age of 10. I was essentially kept at home. I was given the opportunity to be educated, thankfully, but the education was basic, was governmental, even though I went to a private school. It was very limited as to what my aspirations for my career were. And so I did have a very, very naive and secluded upbringing. So I arrived in the United States. I lost everything that was familiar to me. I had no family. I had no friends. I had no sense of relying on anything that I thought would be sort of at my service the way I grew up, because everything was either done for me or not done at all. And here I was confronting an absolutely new world that I had to rebuild from. Now, the luck that I had was the fact that I was multilingual. I could speak the language. I didn't have to start from scratch in terms of learning a new language. I also was familiar with what Western culture looked like because I went to Europe. And so I wasn't taken aback by the modernization of the world that was surrounding me. And I also had an intellectual mindset that did not necessarily alert me to a totally new world. I also came with a sense of economic stability, which many women unfortunately do not have. And so those things felt like a safety net upon which I could then rely on and build. But that freedom came with a lot of uncertainty. And I realized in that moment that courage chose me. Through the exhilaration and the joy of finally having freedom and being with the man who I was madly in love with, I was also terrified. I was also completely alone. Despite the fact that I was with someone that I knew I was in love with, I was alone. And so my liberation came from recognizing that that truth for me was all internal, and that I now had the power to completely pursue it. I realized that my companion throughout my whole life was critical thinking. And I know it sounds like a cliche to say that, but I will emphasize the fact that in today's world, I can tell you, I am terrified at what's happening in the West with the loss of critical thinking and the loss of the ability to think for ourselves and to challenge norms and to feel like that we have to completely submit to groupthink or echo chambers. And this, we're seeing this in all walks of life and in all extremist spaces. I'm not going to turn this into a political or religious conversation, but I do urge you to think and contemplate on the fact that we live in a time where we are told how to think, what to think, even in the West where we think freedom is. And so education and critical thinking were the spaces in which I found that courage. I found the courage to speak and to question things. And for the first few years that I was in the United States, that was wonderful. I felt that sense of liberation. I felt that confidence, and I felt that ability to expand. Things have changed in the last few years, and I can tell you it's been very, very challenging. This brought to my full force, full recognition and acknowledgement that courage is actually a practice. It's not something that you rely on in a moment in your life because there's an urgency or there's a need. Courage became a practice that I had to think about every single day. Every moment of my life, I have to think about courage and the drive to do the things that I need to do. So in the last 27 years, tomorrow actually is my anniversary of 27 years arriving in the United States. I've realized that that path was written in a way that, like I said, most of us see maybe in reflection in the Odyssey, where every moment of our lives we encounter something scary, something unexpected, an overwhelming sense of almost desperation. And if we do not lock into that courage that every single one of us has, even though we're not born with it, we discover it. It is very, very, it is very, very anchoring to wake up every day and think about that courage. So I can tell you that when I arrived in the United States, the first year felt like, here I am. Oh my gosh, I'm a woman. I'm free. I'm learning how to drive. I'm learning how to ski. I'm learning how to go to offices and speak for myself and apply for paperwork that I need to apply for. I learned how to go on a jet ski. I learned how to go on a what are they called? The snowmobile. I saw snow for the first time. All these different experiences. I scuba dived. All the things that were completely held from me were sort of the drive that carried me through that first year. But then as challenges started to creep in and I started to realize that it was beyond the surface of the things that I wanted to do so desperately, I opened up and surrendered to the fact that my life is designed to be is a constant space in which resilience has to be exercised. And I'm really grateful that that happened because it put me in a space where I recognized that a responsibility to be able to stand firmly as an example for others is something that we are all tasked with. And I think many of us comfortably or conveniently choose to relinquish that responsibility. In the 27 years that I've been in the United States, I have gone through many battles. I've climbed many, many hills. I've come down many others. And just some anecdotes of some of the things where courage showed up for me time and time again and where I needed to rely upon it. I married the love of my life. I started a family. I have 3 wonderful sons. And 10 years after being here and starting this new life, I lost the love of my life to suicide. He took his own life, which was an unexpected trajectory that led me to yet another confrontation. And so I was now found with young children. I had not completed my education. I had not started a career to be able to support myself. And I had to start a whole new life. In the midst of starting that whole new life, halfway through, when my sons were barely tweens, not even teenagers, I found out I had breast cancer. And so that was a whole new journey that I had to encounter and walk through again with courage. And I say this to kind of highlight the fact that every single moment of our lives is an opportunity to walk through and face with the sense of gratitude that we have come from something and we're headed to something. And had it not been for the fact that I really jumped off a cliff as a very young person in my 20s to surrender everything I knew behind, to escape and to come to America, had I not done that with the absolute naivete that it was a lot harder than I even realized it was, I wouldn't have been able to face the things in my life. Fast forward, my sons are all in their 20s now. They're grown adults. They're independent. I've completed my education since then. I've earned a master's, and I have built a career for myself that is by far the dream job of my life, and that is working and focusing on women's rights and women's liberation. Courage was not one decision. Every day of my life, I realized courage was a way of living. I started by saying that I saw the Odyssey recently and I was very just moved by it to the extent that I went to watch it again. And my life was really a constant relying and leaning into movies and books because that was my escapism. My real everyday life, especially as a child, a young woman, and a young adult, had zero experiences for me to draw from. And so I had to draw from someplace. That place was those books, those stories, those fairy tales, those movies. And The Wizard of Oz was one of those movies where, and I know it sounds almost cliche to say the lion, the courage, the king of the jungle, but that movie was truly the yellow brick road of my life, where I realized, as we all saw through the book and the movie, that everything we need is within us. And without discovering that one thing that we absolutely have, we can't continue to go through life. Today, I can't say that my life is perfect. It never has been and it never will be. But I can say that I am anchored in a sense of recognition and a sense of self that has allowed me to relate to the world in a way that I never thought imaginable. I have friends, and that's a wonderful addition in your life. But what I have that's greater than friends is a sense of true relatability to the rest of the world, especially the people who I don't know. When I see people's struggles, especially women around the world, and I know that from lived experience, I can draw from that to garner the empathy that is required and the presence that I can offer. I wish I could do more. I think all of us wish we could just show up in the world and do more for everybody else. But just waking up every day and knowing that I am making the choices for myself and extending that to anyone that might benefit from, relating to my story has been the greatest gift. I never set out to tell my story, to go out in the world, to want to share my personal story. And in fact, that has caused a lot of friction with my family of origin because I come from a very secretive culture where you don't go out and you speak. But I realized that that was a responsibility. I realized that had I not lived the life that I lived, I would have been maybe a lot more content. And yet that sense of urgency, that sense of being pulled towards something made me realize that my purpose, and all of us seek that purpose, is to relate to others, is to offer to others maybe hope, maybe a sense of connection. They always say, and I don't like saying it in this context because it sounds negative, but misery loves company. Well, in this case, I kind of reframe that to challenge, and the journey needs company. And we are journeying together, whether we know it or not, or whether we recognize it or not. And so I thank you for taking the time to hear a little bit about my story. It is a joy and a pleasure to be able to relate to everyone, hopefully giving you a sense of connection in our humanity, that while we may have very drastic different experiences, at the end of the day, the bottom line is our humanity brings us to the same core and the same destination. And without that kind of sense of drawing from courage, I can assure you that most of us don't come to the realization that we have that courage to draw from. That courage is always there. And yet, when we are lucky enough to recognize it, we wake up every day, welcome it, embrace it, and lock arms with it and walk with it every single day. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.